like being in front of Patricia. I like you being in front of me. Look at this. Look at lovely.
Gorey, and I don't know if everyone knows that, but the opening to Masterpiece Theater on PBS is him. It's Edward Gorey. That's why we showed it. I want to get started today. My name is Nori. I'm the library director from across the street, and I have the honor of doing the introduction for Anne Bromer today. Anne Bromer and her husband David began Bromer Booksellers in the 1960s, which was located in Copley Square for 45 years. Anne has a graduate degree in library science from Simmons College. While taking a course from the Rare Books librarian at Williams College, Anne and David had a chance to visit and have a hands-on experience with rare manuscripts and beautifully printed books. This experience was the inspiration to open Bromer Booksellers. In 1974, Anne became a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. Bromer Booksellers went on to purchase important collections, including the miniature books of the founder Neiman Marcus. Anne has written articles about and authored books, as well as lectured widely. Her 2007 book, Miniature Books, 4,000 Years of Tiny Treasures, co-authored with Julian Edison, the world's leading collector of miniature books, became a small sensation. It continues to be considered the major volume on the subject, and we have that at the library if anyone wants to look at it. Last year, Anne closed her business, having traveled the world buying and selling rare books for 60 years. Successors to Bromer Booksellers are Anne's longtime associates Philip Salmon and Shannon Struble. They continue to operate at 607 Boylston Street, where Bromer's business had been located since 1980. Anne met many fascinating people during her and David's decades of travel, but none was more curious and none more special than Edward Gorey. Edward Gorey was an American author and Tony Award-winning costume designer, best known for his illustrated books and cover art. His pen and ink drawings often depicted dark stories with a Victorian and Edwardian background. According to the Edward Gorey House Museum, there is no firm count as to the number of books Gorey illustrated for others, but likely well over 500. In addition to this massive commercial workload, Gorey began writing and illustrating his own works, starting with his 1953 book, The Unstrung Harp. The book stands today as one of the early precursors to the graphic novel movement, in which both text and illustration tell the story. Anne has worked on 5 book-related projects with Edward Gorey, and I'm delighted to introduce her as one of our own library trustees.
from my life in family, friends from Nahan, friends from out of town, friends from the Society of Printers. So many friends. Thank you all for coming. I want to say, before I begin, but first of all, I want to thank the library for inviting me, and I want to thank the town of Nahan for keeping this hall open on Saturday afternoon. And all these chairs were not in expectation of today, but for the town meeting we had the other night. So that I lessen expectations and just tell you that I never considered myself part of the inner circle of Edward Gorey's friends. I worked with him over a period of about 15 years. I had a chance to glimpse him in all of his peculiarity. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is my own personal experiences, and I will weave in some biography about him, of course. But, so these are personal reminiscences which came alive once I was invited to do this talk. So on February 22nd this year, there was a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Edward St. John Gorey. It took place in New York City. The venue was the William Hotel, a block from Gorey's former Manhattan residence. Gorey probably would have not liked all the fuss, but he surely would have been touched by the outpouring of affection from 120 people. And this comes 25 years after his death. Most of us came dressed Gorey-esque style. And we drank cocktails named for Gorey books. We enjoyed the multi-tiered birthday cake. Oh, there I am, fully dressed. We enjoyed the multi-tiered birthday cake based on Gorey illustration, and we were entertained by Patti Smith and her daughter, Jessie Paris. Patti had met Gorey when working at Scribner's bookstore in the 1960s, and she was the first to put his work on public sale. Years before meeting Edward Gorey, I saw the Broadway production of Dracula with my husband David. Gorey's agent and our book-selling colleague, Andreas Brown, gave us front row tickets. From that close-up view, we could see Gorey's lavish sets embellished with skulls, bats, vases, and skeletons. Everything on the stage was monochromatic, in shades of black, white, and gray. But each scene had a single splash of red, underscoring the themes of blood and passion in Dracula. Used sparingly, red was a touch of a scarf on a lady's wardrobe, a jewel on a gentleman's cravat, the rose on the lady's skirt, and most sumptuously, the red velvet interior of Count Dracula's cape. Gorey won the Tony Award for Best Costume Designs. While being a lucrative prize, he didn't consider the Tony an honor, he didn't attend the award ceremony, and he regarded the recognition, as he said, a cross to bear. Gorey's sets and costumes were so unusual and so dramatic that the play was more often referred to as Edward Gorey's Dracula rather than just Dracula. Still, he was disappointed with how his carefully detailed drawings were blown up out of proportion to become enormous backdrops. Gorey had first designed these sets in a 1973 summer production at the Nantucket Stage Company's Dracula. He was pleased with the staging in a smaller venue, but he felt that the Broadway show, which opened 4 years later, was completely out of scale. In one of his dramatic outbursts, he exclaimed that he practically had cardiac arrest when he saw them. It was April 1982 at the New York Antiquarian Book Fair when I first met Edward Gorey. David and I were exhibiting books at Bromer Booksellers' booth. We had a small bookcase filled with miniature books at the front. Andreas Brown, owner of the Gotham Book Mart, made a beeline for our books, our booth, and the miniature bookcase. The man Andreas introduced that day as Edward Gorey was by his side. And you see him in this image on a New York street. He had become a fashionista in those days. My first thought was how big he was. 6 foot 2 inches to be exact, and broad-shouldered. He was wearing jeans, clanky silver jewelry and rings, and tennis shoes. His raccoon fur coat, which you see him in the street, had to be checked in the cloakroom before entering the fair. I was quite nervous to meet the designer of Dracula and all those quirky books of which I was smitten. I can't advance it now. I'm sorry for this. So I was quite nervous to meet him. This is a sampling of these books that I was smitten with, as were so many other people. I was a bookseller, never a book collector, except for the books of Edward Gorey. Andreas had introduced his work to me in the early 1970s. Gotham Book Mart sold Gorey's small black and white picture books at the cash register. These nonsense novellas, no more than 30 pages each, were printed from the artist's inky, meticulous handwriting. The stories had sometimes quirky, sometimes really horrifying tales and titles. The loathsome couple was the worst of all. The wuggly ump, the epileptic bicycle, and on the screen, the menaced objects, the tragedies Tobias, and more. They could be preposterous, pointless, frivolous, naughty, satirical, ironic. Most had Gothic overtones and the sense of something lurking within. Terrible things happen to children in these little tales. In the Ghastly Crumb Tiny's, Gorey's most famous book of rhyming couplets, 26 children representing letters of the alphabet perish with every passing letter. Examples on the screen, an additional are: A is for Amy, who fell down the stairs. B is for Basil, assaulted by bears. U is for Una, who slipped down a drain. V is for Victor, squashed under a train. Unlike the 19th century cautionary tales for children, Gorey offered punishment without prior misbehavior. Gorey admitted to never being keen on children. He was an only child born in Chicago on February 22nd, 1925, to parents who divorced when he was 11 and remarried when he was 27. His mother and father, Helen Dunham Garvey and Edward Lee Gorey, who was a reporter for the Chicago Evening Post, moved from one house to another in Chicago many times in Edward's childhood. Sometimes these moves were only a few blocks from each other, but it meant that Edward needed to change schools each time. Because he was recognized as a prodigy from his earliest years, he skipped several grades, graduating 8th grade at age 11. He was drawing pictures as early as 18 months old, and he taught himself to read at age 3.5. He read Dracula between the ages of 5 and 6. Books became his reliable and constant companions and remained so throughout his life. He completed high school with the highest college board scores in the area. He received a full scholarship to Harvard, which had to wait until he completed 2 years of military service and a semester refining his drawing at the Art Institute of Chicago. He entered Harvard in 1946, majoring in French, because he claimed to have already read everything of note in English. At the moment we met in New York at the fair, Gorey was experimenting with various book structures and creating illustrations using unusual formats. This is the reason Andreas took him over to our booth, because he wasn't familiar with the miniature format. But before that, he was working with a peep show format.
Tonight we have
I'm holding one, and I will put it out on this table where there are many objects we will look at afterwards. So you pull it out like a bellows, and it has depth of vision with a story to tell that you look through the front hole called the peephole. In this particular story, he calls it the Tunnel Calamity. He draws a creature thought to be extinct, roaming in the English Tunnel and causing havoc. He was also experimenting with a pop-up book, and this is its only one. This is called The Dwindling Party. It's a macabre pop-up book with illustrations of a family named the McPhizzes, who one by one disappear in bizarre ways when visiting an estate. And the final couplets are, and so the McPhizzes, they vanished forever, at least each and every last one of the rest, except for small Neville, who said, well, I never, but then I expect it was all for the best. Here is the Dwindling Party. So miniature books was a format Gorey was not familiar with. Now he was seeing in our miniature bookcase dozens of books measuring less than 3 inches tall. Something like this in a bookcase on top of our glass stand. I remember him carefully examining nearly every miniature. He seemed transfixed by books, and he offered to accept a commission from us to write, design, and illustrate what would become his first miniature book. We waited more than a year for the manuscript and drawings to arrive, and then one day they did. The eclectic abecedarium came complete with cover papers and labels, all designed by Gorey. The little book was ready for publication. We engaged a Massachusetts printer and bookbinder, and the process of typesetting, printing, and binding began. The alphabetical text is in Gorey's favorite rhymed couplets, similar to the Gashly Crumb Times, but shorter. He patented his form after 18th century New England primers, beginning in Adam's Fall, We Sinned All. You've probably heard these. The original primer text was written by Benjamin Harris, an early journalist in the colonies. In the eclectic abecedarium, Gorey penned his own alphabet of admonitions, satirizing the original moralizing ones. He first wrote the poems and then illustrated the couplets in detailed drawings less than an inch in size. So here you can see samplings of these nonsensical couplets in 2 slides. This is the black and white in the regular edition, and these are the hand-colored ones by Gorey in the deluxe edition. Gorey dedicated the miniature to Mrs. Barbauld, a 19th century children's writer of moralistic texts. Her writing style was prose, not the rhyming couplets of Benjamin Harris. Why Gorey dedicated the book to her and not to Harris is a bit of an enigma. But the more you know about Edward Gorey, the more you find that enigmatic describes him well. The eclectic abecedarium is a very small book, even by miniature standards. It measures 1 1/8 inches tall by 1.5 inches wide. The tiny dimensions nearly drove the binder mad, who asked if Gorey might allow an increase in size by a small margin. Edward would hear none of that, and insisted upon keeping to the size he had designed, not 1/8 of an inch bigger. The 300 regular edition copies and 100 deluxe copies were all signed by him. The hand-colored ones were presented in a fitted box. Every copy sold out at the announcement of its publication. There is another enigma on the deluxe box's label. A creature is raising his teacup in homage to a yellow teapot. The pot is perched on a pedestal with the initials TEA. Gorey's riddle is that the lettering bears no relationship to the creature, the teacup, the teapot, or to tea itself. What is it? It's the titling initials for the eclectic abecedarium. My experience in working with Gorey for this first miniature book is that he was exacting, detailed to a fault, and unyielding in design decisions. But he was so generous when it came to my paying the bill. Edward didn't like to talk about money. I prodded him for a price for the job without receiving an answer. Bromer booksellers paid for production costs to the printer and binder, but no monies were exchanged with Edward for his work. Instead, he was pleased with 20 copies of the deluxe edition and several of the regular for his own dispersal. There was a long hiatus between the eclectic abecedarium and what would become Gorey's second miniature book, not published until 6 years later. We stayed in touch with phone calls, although never on weekday afternoons when the soap opera As the World Turns was on. Gorey loved his soaps and sitcoms. Golden Girls was among his favorite. Gorey embraced both lowbrow and highbrow culture in equal measure, On the opposite end of the afternoon soaps stood Gorey's greatest inspiration. George Balanchine, the Russian-American founder and artistic director of the New York City Ballet. From 1953 to 1983, Gorey attended 160 of his performances every year. Balanchine and Gorey hardly knew each other. Edward said he was standoffish and thought some of it had to do with poor English. Gorey couldn't fully explain why Balanchine's productions meant the world to him. We can suppose that he liked Balanchine's philosophy of not waffling, being certain of his choices, and living his life as he instructed his dancers. Just do the steps. When Balanchine died on April 30th, 1983, it was announced from the stage at a performance Gorey attended. Lincoln Kirsten, the City Ballet's co-founder, stepped in front of the curtain just before the performance began. Addressing the audience, he said, "Mr. B is now with Mozart, Tchaikovsky, and Stravinsky." Gorey didn't want to continue to live in New York after Balanchine's death. Shortly thereafter, he moved to Cape Cod. Gorey's 1973 book, The Lavender Leotard, or Going Aloft to the New York City Ballet, that's the subtitle, was published as tribute to the 25th anniversary of the City Ballet, and he was commissioned by them to create posters that would promote the company. These were designed as pairs of feet in ballet slippers, showing the 5 positions of ballet. The posters were mounted on city buses and in the subways. Bromer booksellers sold a large original subway poster, which is now in the dance collections of Pennsylvania State University. In 1988, the text and drawings for Gorey's second book finally arrived at Bromer booksellers. Titled QRV, Edward's own words describe its meaning. QRV means nothing but cures everything. Many people have tried to guess what the initials stand for. We had a customer who was a mathematician, and he was sure it meant quotient ratio value. There are 29 verses in the book, obscurely akin to Isaac Watts's Divine Songs for Children, to whom Gorey dedicated the book. So as an aside, Dr. Isaac Watts was a 17th century English congregational minister famous for writing hymns. He also wrote the Christmas carol, Joy to the World, and the poem you see on the screen, parodied by Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland. He titled it Against Idleness and Mischief, and it begins, "How doth the little busy bee improve each shining hour." Watts was using the bee as a model for hard work, but in How Doth the Little Crocodile, Carroll's parody, the poem is all about deception. Gorey may have found Watts to have a lightness in writing about theology at a time of strict doctrine for children. He admired him enough to dedicate QRV. Gorey's verses for QRV are funnier and more risque than those in the eclectic Abecedarian. Some are naughty, others are dark. He later referred to QRV as the universal solvent, a legendary substance possessing miraculous medicinal properties. The miniature book was the first time Gorey used the concept of QRV, but he continued writing more verses for a postcard series and incorporated the cure-all elixir in drawings and stage plays. It appears as if QRV was his favorite title of all times. Can you make out the text? Because if not, I can read it to you.
Read it to us, please.
You can see it fine?
No.
No?
Read it to us, please.
Okay.
Read it, please read it.
It clears up rashes, makes mustaches grow thicker rapidly. It also numbs arthritic thumbs. Huzzah for QRV. They caught him in an act of sin, behaving flagrantly. Judicial wrath decreed a bath, insults of QRV. If you would know your privates grow to such immensity that all who saw would ooh and ah, then write for QRV, who once was pretty gay and witty, a spirit wild and free, now lies half dead across the bed, a slave to QRV. When the book arrived without a word, Edward made a design decision to increase its size. He made it 1/4 inch larger in height and width than the eclectic ABC-terium. The binder was delighted. I was relieved. The deluxe colored copies incorporate shades of metallic paint. I remember the clever Mr. Gorey displaying magnetic 3-inch round buttons on his refrigerator with illustrations from the book colored in gold, copper, pewter, and silver tones. Edward was testing out how the metallic inks would work. He liked the look and applied the coloring by hand to the 110 deluxe copies. All were signed and the edition sold out quickly. Always generous, he gifted us several of the buttons. In 1995, for the 1995 Antiquarian Book Fair, I'm ahead of myself. In 1994 and 1995, I invited Edward to illustrate promotional materials for the Boston International Antiquarian Book Fair. It takes place mid-November every year at the Heinz Auditorium. The theme of cats and books, 2 of his favorite subjects, was used on the main poster with an additional set of 5 smaller black and white designs. The poster shows an oversized book displayed against a detailed floral background. The bright-eyed cat is peering over, presumably has been reading it, and the 5 smaller cats down on the bottom are in various ways under, inside, on top of, and otherwise thoroughly engaged in stacks of books. These illustrations were incorporated into the program book for the fair, as well as on postcards and handouts. And image of the 5 cats are on the table for you to see close up. The question of paying Edward was settled with an auction at the book fair, where his original drawings for the promotional materials were sold. He liked that half the sales would be donated to a charity supporting needy booksellers. He also signed all 250 copies of the limited edition posters. For the 1995 book fair, Edward used the theme of elephants with books. Elephants were another great passion in his life. After he moved to the Cape Cod house on Strawberry Lane, he named it the Elephant House, appropriate to its weathered gray facade. For the poster, Gorey painted frolicking elephants among giant books whose pages and covers are adorned with elephant images. Elephants flying off the pages of books or poking their trunks into them are pure Gorey whimsy. He added 6 smaller drawings of elephants, each engaged with the book. Payment for his work was handled the same as the year before, with an auction for the drawings and Gorey splitting the income with the benevolent fund. Once Edward set up house in Yarmouthport in the mid-1980s, we visited him. He lived near his two cousins, Eleanor Garvey, who Edward called Ski, and her sister Elizabeth. Ski was quoted as saying that since she and her sister never had a brother, and Edward never had any siblings, they were all each other's closest relatives. In Gorey's 1971 book, The Deranged Cousins, or whatever, Gorey references the three cousins who meet absurd, macabre deaths. Parked outside Gorey's house at 8 Strawberry Lane was his car with the license plate Ogdred, one of the many anagrams he used as author of his books. In this case, Ogdred Weary wrote one of Gorey's most famous titles, The Curious Sofa, a Pornographic Tale, where innuendos of a sexual nature are made about furniture. In contrast to Gorey's sumptuous illustrations and details in his books and theater work, the interior of his house was bare bones, with little furniture and peeling paint. He owned anywhere from 25,000 to 45,000 books, most stored in the attic, up many creaky stairs without handrails. The lower level of the house was a sprawling cabinet of curiosities from the yard sales Edward frequented on weekends. He collected all sorts of objects that fired up his imagination. Various sized salt shakers, potato mashers, silk tassels, figures of elephants and frogs, rusty tools, and lots of rocks. Gorey loved rocks. I first noticed them when washing his breakfast dishes. He kept peach pebbles in bowls by the kitchen sink, covered in water to show off their luster. He treated rocks as individual characters in creating his own types of Zen rock gardens throughout the house. In Gorey's books, rocks were more than an inanimate object. And I'll show you another form of a book he played with, in which the dancing rock by Ogdred Weary moves on the page if you flip it. This is called a flip book. And it's two-sided, so the other side is the floating elephant. And that's by Dog Ear Ride, and the elephant moves. Gorey once answered an interviewer's question of how after death he would like to come back, as a person or a thing. Gorey replied, as a stone. And then he became melodramatic about thinking he had lost his favorite rock that morning and not being able to live. Such theatrics were not uncommon in an interview or in situations where he might not be comfortable. He could shut down questions he considered unworthy of an answer, and he expressed his dislike of people he considered to be phonies or pretentious. He pitied any opportunist who would think of him as an opportunity. There were rocks down his front steps. Edward was very much a creature of habit. So when David and I visited, we joined him for lunch at Jack's Outback, his favorite haunt, where he ate twice a day. We also went book hunting with him on his daily jaunt to visit Ben Hughes, the owner of Parnassus Book Service, just down the road from Strawberry Lane. David and I stacked up piles of books for our shop, while Edward and Ben, referred to by the locals as the grumpy old men of Yarmouthport, disappeared into their world of conversation and guffaws. All four of us were gleeful among shelves of books. On another visit to Strawberry Lane, I saw a charming watercolor of dancing teddy bears on a Christmas wreath laying on the kitchen table. Across the center of the wreath was a bear on a motorcycle. He was balancing himself on a tightrope with two large fans in his paws. I asked Edward about the piece, and he seemed glum. He told me that it had been rejected by Neiman Marcus for the cover of their annual Christmas catalog. He was led to believe he was being commissioned to produce the cover for their 1994 publication, but learned later that several artists were invited to submit drawings. His teddy bear watercolor was not chosen. Gorey had even made a label at the bottom of the wreath for Neiman Marcus, which I suggested might look nice with a new label, saying Season's Greetings, 1996, Bromer Booksellers. Edward let us buy the watercolor for my offer of $1,000. We mailed a copy of the catalog to all of our customers. The contents were filled with selections from our stock, including many Gorey items. That was the best holiday catalog we ever issued in 60 years. During the latter years of Edward's life, we attended several of his original puppet shows at Theater on the Bay on Cape Cod. These surrealistic entertainments were completely inexplicable to us. The dialogue from the small white heads of the puppets was a hodgepodge of what Gorey himself described as just sort of drivel without interruption. Much of the audience, although devoted to Gorey, were bored, and some left during the performance. But Gorey was in his element and was thoroughly enjoying himself. He sat at the back row of the theater, surrounded by many of his acolytes who participated in the production of these playlets. Edward chortled and laughed out loud, with lines coming from the stage, most of which baffled the entire audience. A myth about Gorey is that he was a recluse. But he wasn't. He was particular. Particular in choosing who he wanted to spend time with. Observing him at the theater, I would think of a more outgoing man, not a loner. Gorey's tastes were both mainstream and esoteric, and his interests were broad. He enjoyed early talkies and silent films. He liked Japanese kabuki theater, and he valued above all other books The Tale of Genji. He adored cats and owned a half a dozen of them at any one time. They would loll on the back of his living room sofas if they weren't on his back, while Gorey sewed by hand his strange, small, shapeless beanbags, using varieties of fabrics and stuffing each with rice. At one visit, I admired a gold lame creature with white button eyes, and Edward noticed my attraction. I didn't leave empty-handed that day, and he wouldn't allow me to pay. He's often portrayed as moody, with surprisingly regular reactions, sometimes. These were true. But kindness and a quiet gentility also defined him. And I was lucky to be the recipient of these qualities. Edward and I tried planning a third miniature book. He suggested miniaturizing an already published text about fans. I was less enthusiastic about redoing a reprint rather than starting with an original text. I considered having it bound in the shape of a fan to add a touch of cachet, but no bookbinder would touch it, so the project faded. I did have one final notion for a miniature book with Gorey, which would match his fame as an illustrator with an equally very respected and famous writer. Occasionally, when Stephen King was in Boston to see his beloved Red Sox, he would visit Bromer booksellers. During one of these visits, I introduced him to miniature books and gave him 2 of our publications. I asked if he would consider writing a short story for a miniature book, which I would publish and Edward would illustrate. What a combination, I thought. King didn't commit to the idea, but he didn't dismiss it out of hand. He said he would think about it. Time went by without an answer, and Gorey's death on April 15, 2000 spelled the end of that publication dream indeed. I'm certain the book would have been a smash success. A decade after Gorey died, the trustees of his estate organized a traveling exhibition. The exhibit would explore the diversity of Gorey's art through his pen and ink illustrations, his preparatory sketches, his unpublished drawings, his hand-illustrated envelopes, and other ephemera. Andreas Brown, my New York colleague, was one of the trustees of the estate. He asked if I could find a venue in Boston. I spoke with the director of the Boston Athenaeum, who was enthusiastic about the idea. In February 2011, a blockbuster exhibition titled Elegant Enigmas, The Art of Edward Gorey opened. The first night, the crowd wound its way entirely down Beacon Street, past the State House, around the corner on Park, and halfway down that street. There were so many people that security guards were necessary to control the number allowed in the building at one time. Gorey's reputation and fame only increased after his death. Multiple books were published on all aspects of his life. These include a controversial biography titled Born to be Posthumous. Gorey's home in Yarmouthport became a museum in 2002. Prices for his more than 100 first edition books published under his own imprint have climbed higher and higher, as have examples of his original artwork. Gorey's art has been commercialized with his images on tote bags, sweatshirts, glow-in-the-dark stickers, coffee mugs, and even an artistic wristwatch. Edward had become a cult figure in the arts, dedicated with a community of collectors, scholars, and fans. In the last year of his life, I kept in touch with cards and silly gifts. When we met, I knew not to discuss his work, as he had early on expressed tedium in holding court about himself. He was matter-of-fact in speaking about his work. He didn't consider that he had a career. What career, he would say. Today I'm drawing a picture, and tomorrow I'm writing a story about that. A few months... Oops. My last few slides. Down to the bottom. after Edward died, a black ring box arrived in the mail from the Gorey estate containing a small gold moonstone ring. This once belonged to his mother. I've been gifted this ring in Edward's will. Because, as I said, I never considered myself part of his inner circle of friends, receiving it was quite a surprise and very touching. I wore the ring to the 100th celebration in February. I got it on now. The year after Gorey's death, my personal collection of signed books and original art was sold through a published catalog. It was dated Thanksgiving 2001. I wrote an introduction expressing my appreciation of having collected so much of his work. My desire to continue building the collection had diminished once he was gone, and I admitted to never being a completist. Gorey's works had brought me great pleasure, and I wanted to spread the joy to others through this catalog. In a short time, every item of the 231 numbered lots found new homes. Gorey had made the world a little brighter and a little darker with each stroke of his pen. In my intersection with him during those heady years we worked together, I was touched by his genius, his easy laughter, and his generous heart. Thank you. That's Avedon, 1992. Isn't that beautiful?
Yes.
Yes.
What did you draw with? Was it ink, pencil?
Pencil and you know, I'm not even sure. It must have been a very fine tipped pen. Because his drawings were very, very, very meticulous. You can see this. Very fine and meticulous. But not much more, you know, use a typewriter. You were lucky enough to get a letter. I think I once got a letter.
Did he share about his creative process when he did the miniature books? His very own personal creative process, coming up with the ideas and
I have no idea.
He did not talk about that?
No, and he doesn't want to talk about it. So you just wait,
Yeah.
okay? And one day it arrives, as I said. So I gave this talk to the Society of Printers a couple of weeks ago. It was a little intimidating because sitting in the audience was the man who was the chief designer at WGBH, who was responsible for working with Gorey for the opening to Masterpiece there. No, his name is Christopher Pullman.
But Derek Graham is also one of
Okay, but this is the man who's sitting there. He actually brought me, which was very generous, he brought me some archival material from that, which I have at home. He didn't want to talk about it, but he had nothing of the experience that I had. And I said to him, I mean, he just found him terribly difficult. And I said, Chris, do you think it's because you had a timetable? You had to get this done. I gave him all the space. I was just thrilled he wanted to do it. I gave him whatever space it was. So the first one took a year, the second one took 6 years. You know, so I think that's part of it. I made no demands on it, yes.
Was there any indication that the macabre subject matter originated with experiences in World War II?
I don't think he served on the front, but actually, I have to go look that up. I don't think so. There's nowhere that I ever saw anything about, I actually don't think he was on the front. I think he was, had some kind of an office job. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what his cousins were like, or, you know, who presently were siblings?
I never met them.
You never met them? Or,
No. I don't even, they may still be alive. I don't know if they are. They lived near him. They were really his closest relatives. He was with them a lot. I think it's why he moved to Yamaport, because they were there. I mean, he wanted out of New York City after Balanchine died. I don't think he ever considered himself so much a city person. He just sort of loved the quiet of the country, of the ocean.
I was just wondering whether they would have an insight into what in his life might have led to this viewpoint, this really, Gothic viewpoint, which is now so common, but
Right.
then.
I'm sure they did. I don't believe even if they're alive, because they were not at the 100th centennial, at the birthday party. I mean, I think he really had a loner life as a child, he was an only child, and parents moving around all the time and getting divorced. I don't think he was overly happy, although he never seemed to talk much about it. Yeah. He didn't even know him. Oh, really? No, he didn't even know him. He went literally to almost every performance when he was in New York. I said 160 each season. And he just, might have said hello, but he really did not know him.
And did Balanchine know Gorey?
Well, he would have seen the same face. night after night, but there's no indication that they knew each other other than more than a cursory hello. And he writes somewhere, or says in an interview, that he was standoffish, but he wasn't sure that was him or it was the lack of English speaking with ease. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did he have any kind of training in art, or was it just a natural?
It was natural, and he had this half a year at the Art Institute of Chicago. That was only ever his formal training. And if you go to the Gorey house, they have behind the glass his first drawing at 18 months old, which looks like kind of a sausage. It's a train. And you can actually make out this is an 18 months old concept of a train. Yeah. Yeah.
Did he belong to any literary clubs, or did he hang out with any other writers?
He was not a joiner. No. I think that's a lot of the reason why he wasn't a joiner. He didn't go to big parties. He wasn't social in that way. What he did is he liked to hang out with people who shared his interests or who he was engaged with in projects. And he had a circle of these friends, okay? And he was such a big movie fan. So on Christmas, for example, he would go with his friends. He didn't have much family, and he was certainly not religious. He was raised Catholic, but he was not religious. And he could have gone to four movies in that day, Christmas Day. That's what they would do. Get a bite to eat between each movie. Yeah.
And you said you were a bit nervous when you were about to meet him, but did you ever get to the point where you felt relaxed around him?
Yes,
You did? Okay.
definitely. I was definitely relaxed. Oh, definitely.
And not
I
at
washed his kitchen dishes. That was the one meal he ate at home. And he didn't cook. I didn't cook for him.
So he wasn't edgy all the time?
Oh, no, he was not edgy with me in the least.
Oh, okay.
He welcomed my phone calls. He was... I went to the movies with him once, and I can't remember what movie I saw with him. Just once walking down the street, and I was coming towards him, and he had on his big, big fur coat. He opened his coat, and he embraced me. He was not touchy-feely, particularly. No, he was lovely. You just accepted him for what he was. He had a very high voice. He had a high, giggly laughter, which some put on. He did say that part of me is real and part of me is a put on. I think he was often acting a part. He was real with me, that's for sure.
You're so warm. But do you think he was on the autism spectrum? I mean, he's the definition of this. Do you think his genius and his communication skills and his timing and all that?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Those not things we were looking at in those days. He was an absolute genius, and he was highly educated. He was not only at Harvard, but self-educated. I mean, he was fluent in several languages. He knew all the classics. I mean, if you read some of these little so-called nonsense books, they're filled with references to things that are pretty esoteric sometimes. He was a complicated figure, and I don't pretend to have really, really known him. I think a lot of people sort of want a piece of him. I just know my experience, which I just shared with you. That was truly my experience. I did these, they weren't important things, but I did these 5 little projects with him, and he seemed very grateful to do them. He wanted to do another one. I'm sort of sorry I turned down his idea about the fans, because I didn't get a chance to do another one. But he wanted to do another one with me. Yeah.
So his massive collection of books, I see that was quite a range of topics? Or
Yes, everything. And I don't think what you would call a valuable collection. They probably went to, he died at 75 on his sofa with his friend, Rick, I forget his last name, right there. He didn't want to have any care. He had a heart condition. He didn't want any care for it, including medicine or anything. He could have lived longer. And this fellow, Ben Hughes at Parnassus Book Service, probably got all the books. Well, thank you. If you